Cilicia in Armenia was first a principality and then a kingdom, which existed from 1080 to 1375. A period of time that encapsulates the whole of the Crusades for the Holy Land. So how did the Armenians get to Cilicia in the first place, and how did they manage to carve out their own kingdom in the Levant, just as the Crusaders had? And what kind of role did this forgotten protagonist play in the story of Outremer? Although Cilicia in Armenia may just look like another Crusader state on a map, it is in fact not. See, the difference between Cilicia and Armenia and the Kingdom of Jerusalem, for example, is that the Western Knights were eager to carve out principalities in the Near East. Doing so would bring themselves and their heirs glory and wealth. The Armenians, whose homeland lay north and east, were not running towards glory, but from it. For them, these so-called Crusades weren't a tale of religious restitution, but a story of survival, perseverance, and plain old stubbornness. Cilicia in Armenia is the accidental and forgotten Crusader state. Cilicia, located on the southeastern corner of the Anatolian Peninsula, is a land of bountiful coastal plains in the south, and in the north the Taurus Mountains dominate the vertical landscape. Cilicia, by means of mountain passes such as the infamous Cilician Gates, is the key holder of who gets in and out of southern Anatolia by land. Across the Taurus mountain range, there are hundreds of fortresses that block these mountain passes. Dating from ancient times to the High Middle Ages, these structures leave Cilicia as one big fortress, and perhaps one of the most defensible spots in the world, as will be illustrated by the Cilician Armenians. By sea, Cilicia sits on the Gulf of Alexandretta, the farthest east that the Mediterranean goes, leaving Cilician ports a hub for eastern trade to flow westward. Since antiquity, some Armenians, mostly merchants and bankers, started to call Cilicia home, as it was quite close to the Armenian heartland. Cilicia was, and seems to always have been, a place of heavy diversity, with various people from all over the Middle East and the Mediterranean laying claim to a coastal mountaintop or two. Eventually, this land became a center for pirates, who terrorized trade for centuries before the Romans finally managed to conquer the interior of Cilicia in the 1st century. To illustrate the defensive capability of Cilicia, it would take the combined efforts of Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, and even Cicero to finally subdue these pirates. Hereafter, Cilicia remained a Roman and then a Byzantine province until the rise of the Caliphate. As the Arabs emerged from the deserts of their peninsula, they conquered half of the Eastern Roman Empire, losing Egypt, the Levant, North Africa, and eventually Cilicia. However, by 965, the Byzantine Empire managed to gather enough strength to retake the Cilician Gates and coastal plains. After this reconquest, the first of 4 mass migrations of Armenians to Cilicia would occur. After retaking their erstwhile province, the Byzantines came to realize that a large percent of the population was no longer Orthodox Christian, but Muslim. Emperor Nicephorus Phocas, a man known as the Pale Death of the Saracens, ordered for a relocation of the Islamic population and an invitation to his fellow countrymen to settle on the coastal plains, and an invitation for the Armenians to settle in the mountains. The new inhabitants got on well, as the Taurus resembled the Lesser Caucasus of Armenia in many ways. The second wave of Armenian migration to the mountains of Cilicia would occur in 1045. In this pivotal year, the last king of Armenia proper, Gagic of the Bagratuni dynasty, would be arrested and taken back to Constantinople as a hostage. Armenia would thereafter be annexed by the Eastern Roman Empire. To lessen the size of any could-be revolt, the Byzantines launched a relocation campaign where thousands of Armenians would be forced to settle all over the empire, and especially in Cilicia. The third, and by far largest migration of the Armenian peoples to the Taurus Mountains would occur in 1064. In this year, the nomadic Seljuk Turks began a proper invasion of Armenia. Raid after raid reduced the countryside to ash as the Byzantines did seemingly nothing. The former capital, Ani, the city of 1,000 churches, would be sacked and never recover. The Armenian refugees fled wherever they could. Most of them joined the growing population already living in and around Cilicia. The fourth and perhaps most devastating migration would occur due to one of the most important military engagements in history, the Battle of Manzikert. In the year 1071, just north of Lake Van, the Byzantine emperor, Romanus Ducas, would be defeated by the Seljuk invaders and taken prisoner. This disastrous battle finally forced the Byzantines to give up on fighting endless wars for the far east of their empire. The Roman withdrawal from Armenia began immediately following Manzikert. While the Eastern Romans had their tails tucked, not all of the Armenians would give up so easy. One of the Byzantine generals present at the Battle of Manzikert was an Armenian named Philaretus. Described as having a, quote, tough and robust character, he assumed command of the army upon the capture of the emperor, and led the retreat to a nearby fort. Seeing Emperor Romanos captured and realizing that he was the highest-ranking general left in the Byzantine East, he declared himself emperor on the spot. Back in Constantinople, the throne was passed on to a 20-year-old member of the emperor's family. Michael VII Ducas was widely regarded as a weak and a palace emperor, a man in no place to confront a Seljuk invasion and a brooding civil war. The land that initially fell under the domain of the self-proclaimed Emperor Philaretus included Antioch to the south, half of Cilicia, and a sliver of Armenia to the north. In many ways, this short-lived state would become a bridge to Cilicia for the Armenian people. Philaretus had a steep road ahead of him, embroiled in a Byzantine civil war from the start and defending against the Seljuks who had just crushed the largest army in the region. He would spend the next 7 years defending this splinter state using an interesting combination of Normans, Byzantines, and Armenians in his army. While Philaretus was fighting his uphill battle, two Armenian noble families moved their courts and created their own principalities. In 1079, the last Bagratuni king of Armenia was assassinated in Constantinople. This immediately began a push of Armenian nobles from the Byzantine Empire. The first of these noblemen was named Oshin, and with his brother Halgrim, with his wife and other nobles, carrying his wealth and the finger of the holy apostle Peter, he entered Cilicia and captured from the Muslims the fortress of Lampron, at the foot of the Taurus Mountains towards Tarsus. The stronghold mountaintop fortress of Lampron was a great pick. Its position dominating the highlands above the city of Tarsus would leave the descendants of Oshin in great position to rival the dominant Armenian dynasty in Cilicia. Reuben entered the Taurus range soon after Oshin, although much farther to the north and in the heart of the mountains. Reuben is reported to have been a distant relative of the Bagratuni dynasty, perhaps a sister branch, although no concrete evidence can connect him to the kings of the homeland. We do know, however, that Reuben was an experienced general in the army of King Gagic before his capture in 1045. When the Byzantines killed his king, Reuben fled to the mountains, but not in search of a Muslim-occupied fort such as Lampron. In 1080, Reuben arrived before the Byzantine manned walls of Kopitar Fort. He captured the castle and became the Lord of the Mountain. With the nobles of King Gagic now flooding into Cilicia, along with more Armenians from the east, Lord Reuben set his target on the Byzantine fort next to his own mountain. In 1083, Reuben added the fort of Pardezerpart and the land that accompanied it to his fledgling principality. By 1080, Philartus had surrendered to the Byzantines and began fighting for them again as the newly styled Duke of Antioch, the last man to ever hold such a title. In 1084, Antioch was lost to the Seljuks, and by 1087, Philartus was dead. The semi-independent realm that he had built as a marcher lord would leave a handful of small and insignificant Armenian kingdoms clustered around the city of Edessa. With this, Reuben's Cilicia was now the largest holdout for the Armenian people. Yet another wave of migrants fled to Cilicia as Reuben continued besieging Byzantine fortresses in the Taurus Mountains. Nearly every year Reuben went on campaign, and nearly every year he had a brand new fort to show for it. His principality was still small, but its position was all but secured by the new mountains that they now called home. Now let's check back in with our other Armenian dynasty in Cilicia, Ocean of Lampron Castle. In a complete contrast to Lord Reuben, Ocean was content being a loyal Byzantine vassal, already marking him out as an enemy in the eyes of Reuben. Lord Reuben continued growing and consolidating his realm, all while the other Armenian kingdoms were frozen to inaction by Seljuks or Byzantines. For 15 years, he reigned as the first Lord of the Mountains, a term synonymous with the Armenian rulers of Cilicia. In 1095, Reuben would die. Gone away was the Bagratuni dynasty, even if Reuben was a part of it. His descendants would forever be referred to as the Reubenids. His son Constantine would take up the lordly mantle and begin his eventful rule over the mountains. He immediately started where his father had left off, beginning the conquest of the smaller mountain range to the north, known as the Anti-Taurus Mountains. Holding this complementary range meant that Cilicia now had another line of defense from any would-be invaders. It also allowed for the Armenians to settle in the lush valley that separated the Taurus Mountains from its northern counterpart. But just as Constantine began his reign, everything would change. From Western Europe, growing religious fervor and a call for help from the Byzantine Empire would result in the First Crusade. A conglomerate of dukes and counts from lands as far as France and Frisia would arrive in Cilicia in 1096. As discussed previously, Cilicia was the gateway that connected Anatolia to the Levant. Anyone who wanted to get to Jerusalem by land would be forced to pass through the Cilician gates. They made no attempts to raid the countryside as they just had through Byzantine Anatolia. On the contrary, the Crusaders found a strange ally in Cilicia. While they were running toward the Seljuk horde, the Armenians were running from them. To the Crusaders, they saw the Armenians as fellow Christians and a valuable asset. Having access to the Cilician gates could guarantee the success of the Crusades. And as long as it wasn't in the hands of the infidels or the Byzantines, they didn't care who owned the mountains north of the Holy Land. For Constantine of Cilicia, the Crusaders presented a lifeline. The Knights of Western Europe were powerful, and enemy to the enemies of the Armenians. These strangers from the other side of the world were a prayer come true for the Armenians, and they may just be their saving grace. The Lord of the Mountains fed the starving Crusaders as they continued toward their mission. While most of the Crusaders left Cilicia for Jerusalem, one of the many French nobles veered from the Holy City in search of his own destiny, separate from the constantly feuding camp of the First Crusade. Baldwin of Verdun would venture east, ally with the local Armenians, defeat the Seljuks, and capture the city of Edessa. Whereafter he would name himself as the Count of Edessa, the first of the Crusader states. The Crusades already produced one fruitful and pro-Armenian country. The Armenians in the newly created county of Edessa regarded Baldwin as their liberator. After all, he had just secured the safety of the Armenian Church. At this time, the headquarters of the Armenian Apostolic Church was in the city of Dizvak. just to the west of Edessa. Baldwin of Verdun could now be considered a protector of the Armenian faith. While Baldwin was carving out the county of Edessa, the other Crusaders were plundering their way down the Levantine coast. They didn't get very far before reaching their first major obstacle, the old city of Antioch. The city that once held the premier patriarchy even over the Pope back in Rome was not so easily falling back into Christian hands. Lord Constantine of Cilicia supplied the Crusaders with food, manpower, and even siege equipment. With help from a local Armenian guide, the Crusaders found an entrance into the city and conducted what can only be described as a slaughter. Muslim and Christian populations alike found no mercy, as the first Crusaders made their holy intentions clear. For assisting his unexpected new allies, Lord Constantine was awarded by receiving a French knighthood and much of the loot from Antioch. On top of this, the Lord of Cilicia made a considerable amount of wealth just by simply feeding these foreigners. By 1099, the Crusaders had captured Jerusalem, thus fulfilling the religious provocation that had started this holy war. Following the end of the First Crusade, the victors split their prizes by divvying up the land into 4 distinct Crusader states. First and foremost was the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Going north was the smallest and weakest new country, the County of Tripoli. Bordering the latter and Cilician Armenia in the north was another principality, this of course being Antioch and its new Norman prince, Bohemond of Taranto. And as discussed previously, there was Count Baldwin and Edessa, the oldest of these new states in the Middle East. If you look at a map, Cilician Armenia is indistinguishable from the other Crusader states. It might as well have been the pre-Crusader state. The success of the First Crusade was not only a win for the Western Christians, but also one for the Cilician Armenians. If not for the arrival of these Western knights, then who knows how long it would have taken for the Seljuks or the Byzantines to conquer Cilicia. At this point, the Crusaders were Cilicia's greatest ally, and the feeling was mutual. These unlikely friends from different but similar backgrounds interacted with each other in a few key ways that changed the trajectories of both factions. Perhaps most important for the survival of the Rubinids was the willingness of the Crusader kings to marry Armenian noblewomen, and even the Rubinid dynasty themselves in Edessa. This makes sense considering the county of Edessa held a huge Armenian population. The most forgotten impact of Cilicia Armenia during the Crusader Wars was the many Armenian bankers who would help to fund the Westerners. Similar to the Jews, the Armenians were a middleman from east to west, and just like them, the Armenians have been renowned bankers throughout the centuries. Like Judaism, there was no rule in the Armenian church against lending people money and charging them interest, leaving the Armenians in a highly favorable position if any of the Crusader states happened to fall on hard times. Cilicia would become an economic center. As the Crusaders' debt grew, Cilicia's wealth snowballed. Cilicia was also a valued trade partner for the Westerners, as their position guarding the gates of Anatolia could block any food shipments coming inland from the north. The Crusaders also intermingled with the Armenian population in Cilicia, with many Norman knights finding their homes in this principality over the entirety of the Crusades. The reluctance to attack anyone with a slightly different faith than Catholicism is perhaps the strangest thing about these two stories combining. The Crusaders seemed to accept the Armenian Christians. After all, their state was the first in history to accept the faith. It's likely that the Crusaders thought the Armenian Church was a strange Eastern brand of Christianity, but far above heresy. In 1102, only a few years after the end of the First Crusade, Constantine, the Lord of the Mountains, would die in a very flashy manner. The Lord sat on the balcony of his fort in Vaca, which had recently become the capital of Cilicia. Storms were on the horizon, but Constantine loved to watch the dark clouds roll over and around the mountains, While sitting at his table, that I assume was made out of some kind of conductive metal, it was struck by lightning. Constantine didn't die right away from his near smiting, but a few days later, he was gone. With Constantine scorched, his son became the new lord of Cilicia and Armenia. His name, similar to the Taurus mountains that he ruled over, would be Tauros. Despite his father being struck by lightning, his transition to the throne would be a smooth one. From the very start of his reign, he continued the tradition of taking all the mountain forts to the west that belonged to the Byzantine Empire. Taking 3 forts over the course of 5 years, his lordship was off to a great start. In 1107, Tauros was presented with the biggest opportunity of his life, and it was from an unlikely source. Prince Tancred of Antioch instructed Lord Tauros to march down the Pyramus River and take Cilicia's most bountiful and ancient city, Cis. With Tancred's advice to strike where the Byzantines were weak, he had just given up a valuable and conquerable land. Only a true ally would give another lord such advice. Tauros did as Tancred instructed and took his army along the banks of the Pyramus until reaching the fort of Anazarbus, the only obstacle on the way to Cis. Anazarbus sat on a plateau with huge cliffs on all sides. The fort had been considered an impregnable structure for the past few decades, but the Armenians had been capturing some of the most mountainous forts in the world, before and ever since they arrived in Cilicia. Anazarbus fell within a few months. Tauros ordered for a rebuilding of the fort to act as his new gateway to the Cilician heartland. Soon enough, Tauros found himself under the walls of Cis. Tancred of Antioch was right. It was exposed, and its garrison was rather small. The Armenians won the siege in short time. Away from the mountain villages and towns, the first true city was under the thumb of Lord Tauros. Upon entering Cis, the Lord of Cilicia named the city as his new capital. Cis was a beautiful old city. Founded during the times of the Roman Republic, it featured 2 connected mountains that shared a small, elevated plateau between them. A wall guarded the entrance to this plateau, as fortresses sat on the top of the 2 twin peaks. The Armenians finally had another 3-letter city as their capital. Gone was the 1,000 churches of Ani. Here were the Cilician gates of Cis. In 1108, the large-scale stability that Cilician Armenia had enjoyed since the arrival of the Crusaders would be shattered. The Seljuk splinter state, called the Sultanate of Rum, or Rome, would burn its way through the gates. The Sultan raided through the hills of the countryside, skipping over the mountains and their many forts. Lord Tauros sat at his new capital, helpless in the face of the nomadic warriors. His numbers could not match the horde of Rum, so he called the second most powerful Armenian in the region. To the east, beyond Edessa, there were 4 small Armenian states left over from the short-lived empire of Philartus. The strongest of these nations was at the center, under the domain of a man named Vassal the Robber. This name, although an unfortunate one, was not one that he received from his own people, but the Crusaders, who Vassal despised. Vassal was just as powerful as Tauros at this time if you counted the other 3 Armenian states that he had managed to vassalize. With these underlord armies at his disposal, Vassal marched west, towards his brethren in Cilicia. While Tauros stayed in his mountain, Vassal managed to win a decisive battle near the border of the Rubenid realm. As per their agreement, Vassal shared the loot with Tauros and soon thereafter returned to his overexposed kingdom. Before leaving, he probably wished that he could trade places with the Lord of the Mountains. Only 3 years later, more of the same would occur. The Rum Sultanate, this time led by its ruler, Malik Shah, invaded Cilicia. This time, no help from the east would come to save Tauros. He would have to defeat them himself. Or find someone who could. He handed over the command of the army to 2 well-seasoned nobles and watched as they were led in procession out of the gates of Cis and into the gates of Cilicia. After a few days, the tattered army returned, defeated and its 2 generals dead. It appeared as if the Turks may just steamroll Cilicia. And that's when the brother of Tauros stepped to the plate. Leo, the son of Constantine and only brother of Tauros, would lead the next and perhaps last fieldable army of Cilicia. Taking his men past the gates, Tauros hoped the fate of his 2 generals would not follow his brother. The Armenian army returned, triumphant with Leo at the head of it. He had perhaps just saved Cilicia and Armenia from utter annihilation. His skills on the battlefield had been proven, but not yet were they showed on full display. In the following year, brazened by his near destruction, Lord Tauros set his eyes on revenge. The assassins of the last king of Armenia proper, Gagic II Bagratuni, were still on the loose, and far too close to do nothing about. The fortress of Sisistra was the only thing that separated Tauros from the 3 brothers who ended the line of Bagrat. To truly pass the torch from one ruling house to another, Tauros needed to avenge the rulers of the homeland. The Armenians laid in the forest surrounding Sisistra Castle. After Tauros gave a signal, the ambush began. The Armenians surprised and overran the Byzantine garrison, killing all of them with no mercy to avenge their lost king. The slaughter extended to the civilian population of Sisistra as a cloud of dark smoke rose from the townhouses all the way to the inner keep. Here, the 3 brothers who had assassinated King Gagic pled for their lives. The brothers were beaten savagely before one of them finally revealed where they were keeping King Gagic's ceremonial sword and tunic. Once the artifacts of the dead king were recovered, Tauros immediately began to beat the man who had told him the location. Even after falling unconscious, Tauros continuously, savagely struck him, until he was motionless and dead. After collecting himself and standing, his knuckles bloodied, Tauros said, "Such monsters did not deserve to perish by the quick plunge of a dagger." The Lord then took the 2 remaining brothers who would rot in his prison and Gagic's sword back to his mountain. If the Rubinids weren't a descendant of the Bagratuni, Tauros certainly avenged them as if they were his kin. While Tauros was tying up loose ends, in the east, past the county of Edessa, the son of Vassal the Robber, Vassal Dia, was making moves. While Tauros regarded the Crusader states as his closest ally, Vassal looked to Edessa as a means to expand his realm. In 1114, Vassal allied with the Seljuks, prompting a preemptive strike from the Crusader states of both Antioch and Edessa. Vassal managed to survive the invasion, but his 2 most premier fortresses barely outlasted their besiegers. They would be back, and with the Seljuk alliance only proving to get him in trouble, Vassal looked to the Lord of the Mountains. In 1116, Vassal arrived in Cilicia after an invitation from Tauros to discuss a possible marriage alliance. When the Easterner arrived, Tauros ordered for his imprisonment and sold him to the Count of Edessa, who promptly annexed all of his land. While Vassal the Robber would save Cilicia, Tauros would destroy the Armenian holdouts in the east. Soon after their liege lord's imprisonment, the other 3 small and now undefended Armenian nations fell to Edessa and the Seljuks, leaving Cilicia as the standalone and final homeland for the Armenians. If they do not protect this last vestige, they will be pushed into the very sea. After growing his ally in Edessa and his own wealth, Tauros would be called on by his other neighboring westerner, Prince Roger of Antioch. The prince requested his ally to join him on campaign in the east and against the Seljuk Empire. Tauros sent an expeditionary force of a few thousand, under the command of his battle-proven brother. Leo joined the Crusader camp in 1118 alongside Roger of Antioch and his many vassal lords. Together they marched into Syria and besieged the city of Azaz, which sat only a few miles from the ancient metropolis that was Aleppo. The Seljuk defenses faltered under the combination of mounted Crusader knights and mountain Armenian infantry. Following this, Leo and Roger returned to their respective lands. The seizure of Azaz was only the start of Prince Roger's ambitions. The gates to Aleppo were now open, and another grand city in the east was to fall to the Knights of Europe. But it was not destined to be. A year after Roger and Leo captured Azaz, the Prince of Antioch would finally confront the ruler of Aleppo on the battlefield. By the end of the day, most of Antioch's army laid in a field of their own blood, Roger of Antioch among them. This battle severely weakened the Principality of Antioch. It would never truly recover, only dwindle. Cilicia would fill the power gap left by its ally. Tauros took the initiative, and in the following year of 1120, the Lord of the Mountains would finally flood onto the coastal plains. The Armenian armies descended from Sis and started taking Byzantine forts on the Cilician plain, just as they had in the Taurus Mountains. Year after year, castle, town, and fort fell to Tauros. This expansion southward would put Tauros in conflict with the only other Armenian state in the world, the Lords of Lampron. They weren't independent, but a vassal in the Byzantine Empire. Tauros treated them no different than the Romans, taking nearly half of their land by 1129 and incorporating all the Armenians that lived there into the Rubenid Principality. At this point, Tauros had reigned for some 30 years, and in that time he had more than doubled the size of Cilician Armenia. In February of 1130, the Lord of the Mountains died in the city of Sis that he had named the new capital. Tauros was a very calculating ruler, and even ruthless at times. He quite literally beat the Byzantines bloody throughout the entirety of his reign. He also wasn't afraid to confront his fellow Armenian countrymen if they presented a threat or an opportunity for him, leaving the Rubenids as the last independent Armenian state. A favorable geopolitical position that would create even more of an influx of Armenians to migrate to Cilicia. Tauros was a ruler who wasn't afraid to get his hands dirty or bloody. Exactly the type of ruler Cilician Armenia needed if it was to survive in this hostile world. And exactly the type of ruler Tauros' son was not. Constantine II would barely become Lord of the Mountains before he was thrown in jail and soon thereafter, poisoned. This was not the place and time for a new and unexperienced generation, not when there was so much left in the tank for the older and wiser. Constantine was the only son of the late Tauros, leaving his brother, Leo, as the new Lord of the Mountains, and now, half of the plains. It's unknown if Leo had anything to do with the death of the young Constantine, but one can only assume, as he had the most to gain. On a small side note, assassinations are surprisingly numerous throughout all of ancient and medieval Armenian history. I would like to see the total kill count, but I'm afraid that number might just scare me. With Leo, the experienced general, at the head of Cilician Armenia, he looked to continue expanding his realm immediately. Not only on the map, but also in his city. Lord Leo constructed a massive royal palace on one of the twin peaks of Sis, building a church and a small town on the hill where his nobles and advisors would live as neighbors. Along with this, he also built many gardens on his mountaintop, for both beauty and safety in the event of a siege. Other than funding a massive building project, Lord Leo began his reign over the mountains by forming an alliance with Emir Ghazi of the Danishman Turks to the north. This he only did to replace the alliance that had already been broken. In 1130, seeing that the Lord of Cilicia had been assassinated, the new Prince of Antioch, Bohemond II, invaded his Armenian ally. Now that Tauros had conquered the northern part of the Cilician plain, it left a soft underbelly for the Crusaders to start their invasion. All they had to do was take the fort of Anazarbis, and then it was on to Sis. Lord Leo invited Emir Ghazi and his army into his lands, promising him all the loot from the battle if they could just defeat the Knights of Antioch. Bohemon's scouts never saw the horse archers galloping toward the surprised Crusaders. Confusion ran through the lines as they did not expect and were not ready to face a Turkish army in Cilicia. Bohemond and his army faced a crushing defeat. During the combat, the Prince of Antioch was killed. His head was thereafter sent to the Abbasid Caliph in Baghdad. After deflecting the Antiochian invasion, Leo turned his gaze back onto the Byzantine-controlled coastal plains. It was finally time to connect the Armenians to the Mediterranean, a feat that hadn't been done since the times of Tigran the Great, more than 1,000 years ago. A year following his ascension, the Armenians would overrun the Cilician coast, occupying the far east of Byzantine possessions on the Mediterranean Sea. This would prove to be a false hope as the Byzantines retook their coastline near the Levant. The Armenians were defeated, but by the next year they were back, and this time in full force. In 1132, Lord Leo seized the coast and took the cities of Adana, Tarsus, and Mamistra. Along with Sis, these 4 cities were the largest in Cilicia, blooming the population of the now coastal Armenian Principality. Leo would continue expanding west along the coast until he was finally forced to a standstill at the Siege of Seleucia. With the Cilician coast in Leo's hands, the Armenians could fully embrace one of their wealthiest industries: trade. The ports of Cilicia bustled with merchants of all ethnicities. Cilicia's greatest ally, the county of Edessa, now had another friend that connected the landlocked Crusader state to the sea, and by extension, to the rest of the world. A large portion of Edessa's trade would flow through Cilicia. This explosion of commercial activity in Cilicia attracted a familiar phenomenon to the many inlets and bays of the coast. The Cilician pirates had returned. In antiquity, the Cilician pirates were a menace to the eastern Mediterranean, using the mountain cliffs to hide among their troves of treasures acquired from the Levant and beyond. The farther one got from the main coastal cities, the less control the Armenians had over that land. After taking the coast, Lord Leo waited a year before finally taking his revenge on the princes of Antioch. The Armenian army assembled and marched south, arriving under the mountain fortress of Sarvindikar. Built by the Franks after the First Crusade, this castle was the seat of Lord Baldwin of Mirage. In due time, the fort fell to Cilicia, and for the first time, the Armenians had invaded a Crusader state. This was, of course, a revenge campaign. The Count of Edessa understood this, especially now since the Armenians not only held the Cilician Gate, but with Sarvendikar, they also controlled the Syrian gates. The easiest way for Edessa to access the coast. With Antioch's broken alliance going in the opposite direction that they had hoped for, Leo turned his gaze west, towards the traditional enemy of the Rubinids, the Byzantine Empire. Lord Leo finally managed to break through the coastal fortress of Seleucia in 1133, and for the next 3 years he would expand his realm at the expense of the Byzantines, and almost completely enveloped his Armenian rival in Lampron. By 1136, the Lord of the Mountains was perhaps as powerful as the kings of Jerusalem. When speaking of the first inner Crusade period, the Eastern Christian Armenians were the real winners. This wasn't a field trip for them, it was a last stand, and so far, they had made the most of it. But just as Leo led Cilicia and Armenia to its greatest territorial extent, it would all come crashing down in the matter of a few years. In 1136, Raymond of Poitiers became the new Prince of Antioch. Raymond also just so happened to be the older brother of Baldwin, the Lord of Sarvendikar that Leo had only recently taken. This prompted Raymond to mark the opening of his reign by invading Lord Leo's Cilicia. Together with his brother, Prince Raymond invaded Cilicia, attempting to re-establish control over the Syrian gates. This prompted the Count of Edessa, Jocelyn II, to get involved. Edessa and Cilicia and Armenia were the closest of allies by this point, so close in fact that the Count of Edessa was Lord Leo's own nephew, as the Rubinids had married many crusading noblemen. With Raymond at the gates, Count Jocelyn decided that his alliance to his uncle was far more favorable than to Antioch. He joined armies with Lord Leo, and together, they defeated the Prince of Antioch and sent him running back to his city. Lord Leo was now successfully playing the crusading states off of one another, picking their fragile alliances apart with good diplomacy and strategic marriage alliances. After his defeat, Raymond's brother, Lord Baldwin, invited Leo to the peace table. Leo accepted this, seeking to finally put an end to the one-sided rivalry. When Cilicia's lord arrived at Baldwin's castle, he was shown firsthand what it was like to be treated as an enemy of the Crusaders. He was captured and imprisoned, much like Vassal was a few years ago. In the absence of their father, the sons of Leo bickered amongst themselves over the succession, and if there should even be one, while their father was still alive. The eldest son, Constantine, attempted to become the Lord of the Mountains, but was blocked by doing so by his 3 younger brothers. Not only did they prevent him from being prince, but they also blinded him so he could never try to claim the throne again. While the Rubinids were shuffling over royal authority in Cis, the Danishmen Turks, who had previously been allied to Leo, invaded the northern mountains of Cilicia. The only hope for defense was that the mountain fortresses would hold out, as the sons of Leo were in no position to leave the capital, in case another brother got another idea. By 1137, Lord Leo had finally negotiated a proper ransom. He would return Servendikar to Lord Baldwin and give up the cities of Mamistra and Adana to Prince Raymond of Antioch. On top of these land grants, Leo was to also pay 60,000 gold pieces to his captors. To make sure he fulfilled these obligations, Leo's son, Tauros, was to be held as a hostage in Antioch. With the ransom met, Lord Leo returned to his once powerful realm that was already starting to unravel itself in his absence. As soon as Leo was free of his captors, he disregarded the treaty. The only thing that the Crusaders received was the 60,000 gold pieces. No land, and no hostage. Lord Leo then defeated the invading Danishmen Turks and restored Cilicia to its previous prosperity before his arrest. With Cilicia and Antioch trading punches, the Byzantines smelled the blood in the water. Emperor John Komnenos assembled an army and moved dangerously close to his lost coastline in Cilicia. With this, Antioch and Cilicia held a common rival, and with John pressing down on both of them, they decided to bury the hatchet, at least for the time being. A peace treaty between Raymond of Antioch and Leo of Cilicia was negotiated, with Count Jocelyn of Edessa acting as the mediator. After all, it was in his best interest to keep his coastal allies alive. The Byzantine reconquista of Cilicia began in 1137. Outside of Seleucia, the Lord of the Mountains gave battle to the Emperor of the Romans. Finally turning the tide on the Cilician front, he defeated Leo's army and soon after retook the entire coastal plain. The Byzantines even took the fortress of Anazarbus that guarded the entrance to the city of Cis. They were only one step away from Leo's capital, but instead of continuing this campaign in Cilicia, Emperor John moved toward the Crusader states. The Byzantines pushed into the Principality of Antioch, where Prince Raymond, along with Count Jocelyn of Edessa, signed a treaty that would reduce the 2 Crusader states to the status of Byzantine vassals. With the Crusaders compelled to surrender, Emperor John turned his attention back to the Armenians of Cilicia. In due time, the massive Byzantine army retook the city of Cis, as Lord Leo fled into the interior of his mountains. All the gains that Cilicia had made in Leo's lifetime would be lost. And all of it, really. In 1138, the Lord of the Mountains was finally pinned down in the fortress of Feke. Here, he would make his last stand. I'm apt to believe that Leo would have gladly died fighting the Byzantines, but he would never get the chance to do so. Soon after the siege began, Emperor John called for a meeting with the Lord of Cilicia. This was only the bait, as Leo fell into the same exact trap 2 times. Lord Leo, along with his sons Reuben and Tauros, would be captured and taken back to Constantinople. Here they were thrown into the dungeons of Byzantium. With Leo's capture, the short-lived Principality of Armenian Cilicia came to an abrupt end. Upon arriving in Constantinople, Lord Leo was initially treated as a common prisoner, but eventually he became more like an honored guest of Emperor John. The elderly Leo would spend the rest of his life in this condition until his death in 1140. Directly following his demise was his son, Reuben, who would be blinded and subsequently murdered. The establishment of the Armenian Principality of Cilicia is a story of endurance and a point of nationalist pride for many Armenians. From humble origins, the Reubenids wrestled Cilicia away from Byzantium and aggravated Antioch with its unexpected success. Armenian Cilicia, in a sense of the phrase, can be considered the accidental Crusader state. While they started before the arrival of the Crusaders, the story of Cilicia truly begins and ends with the arrival and departure of the Knights from the West. With the Crusader states and Armenians still remaining, it was only a matter of time before the revival of Armenian Cilicia. If you want to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month and join Derek Clark, Savak Leo Nazarian, Taj Guilford, Nick Mate Voisian, Lazarus Dikos, and Dave J. Or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again and Donald Vincent. Thanks again for supporting the channel and a warm welcome to my brand new patrons. I really appreciate you guys.